Let me begin by asking a couple questions, if I may. How many of you, by show of hands, have Mormon friends or relatives? Quite a few of you. How about Jehovah's Witness friends or relatives? How many of you have spent time witnessing to Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses before? Did you have a good time? Sometimes witnessing to Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses can feel like beating your head against a wall. And that it feels really good when you stop. And sometimes I think it feels that way because they seem to know the Bible better than we do, or at very least for every verse that we use to support our position, they have 3 or 4 or 5 in response, and it can be very tedious to unravel the verses that they use to support their views. This afternoon, what I'd like to discuss with you is what these kinds of groups have in common. Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and a few other groups as well. But I'm going to be using examples from Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses exclusively because they're the ones who come to our doorsteps. They're the ones who come to us. And I think the best way to explain why this material is so important to me personally is to introduce you to my family. I'm not related to all these styling guys, just one of them. This is my great-great-grandfather. He's got a nice striped suit on. He was put in the state penitentiary in Utah 3 separate times for practicing polygamy, which means I have a bigger family than you do. When you get together for family reunions, you know, the whole county shows up. And it's where you look for a spouse and things. No, just kidding. Just kidding. That only happens if you're from Arkansas and West Virginia. If you're from one of those states, sorry. I was born and raised in a small town in northern Utah by the name of Brigham City, Utah, which is named after the second prophet and president of the Mormon Church, Brigham Young. And I was born into a Mormon family, believing that I was a Christian as I grew up, because the official name of the Mormon Church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And you've probably seen their television commercials before, I would imagine. I was born and raised believing that I was a Christian. When people would come to us and say that Mormons were not Christians, we were quite simply baffled because we used the name of Christ. We said that we believed that Jesus was the Son of God. We didn't understand why someone would deny that we were Christians based on what we believed. In 1985, I had an aunt and an uncle who exited the Mormon Church. They did so for a number of different reasons. But time and again, they sought to witness to us because they became Christians at the same time. But every time we'd have a conversation, it would devolve into a debate of one flavor or another, where I would offend them and they would offend me, and we didn't get very far in our conversations. In 1987, though, my mother invited my aunt and uncle up for the Thanksgiving meal, which was an interesting thing to do because we were discouraged in doing those things. The leaders in the Mormon Church said, your relatives are now apostates. Don't associate with them or you might become deceived yourselves. So we kept some distance, but my mother invited them up for a Thanksgiving meal. And you know what happens right after the Thanksgiving meal, don't you? Or don't you? Everyone's semi-conscious, entirely bloated, right? The young guys, they go outside and they play football, and the older guys stay inside and they watch football. And the ladies get stuck doing the dishes, right? And maybe that's the way it should be. You guys who are clapping, you're so naive. Oh, man. I said maybe. See, this is something you have to negotiate in your own households. In my household, we have what is called a benevolent dictatorship. And my wife is very good to me. In 1987, though, I ended up in the living room with my Uncle Rick after the meal. We began discussing all sorts of issues, what I thought were the most important issues of life, what I was studying at university, what I was going to be when I grow up, and things like this. But very quickly, the conversation turned to religious subjects, and he began insisting that I needed to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. This was offensive to me because, after all, I was the member of the one true church. He was the apostate. So I asked him that afternoon, though, to explain to me why it was he had left the one true church behind, what it was he now believed, and why he believed it. And our conversation lasted for about 2.5 or 3 hours that afternoon. We discussed what felt like everything under the sun. For the doctrine of the Trinity, the reliability of the Bible, whether or not Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, was truly a prophet, whether or not there was a great apostasy where authority for the sacraments was lost from the face of the earth, and so on. By the end of our conversation, I was pretty fed up with what I thought was an overall bad attitude on his part. I realized sometime later that, in fact, what it was is that I didn't have adequate answers to his questions and objections. But I thanked him for ruining our Thanksgiving Day and asked him to leave. And he did, he and his family. And that night, for the first time in my life, I began wondering, what if the Mormon Church is not the one true church after all? The next morning when I awoke, I began to pray. I said, God, I know you're there. And I know the Mormon Church is the one true church, and that Joseph Smith is the prophet of the restoration, and that the Book of Mormon is the Word of God, but please help me find answers to my uncle's questions and objections, so I can tell him the truth, and he and his family can rejoin the true church. That afternoon, I went down to my aunt and uncle's home, and I asked them to explain to me again why it was they left the true church behind, what it was they now believed, and why. And this time I took notes, several pages worth of notes. And I left their home that afternoon, and I went to a local Christian bookstore in Ogden, Utah. And I made my way to the back of the bookstore. You know where the good books are? I don't know what your Christian bookstores are like where you live, but if you have a habit of buying the books near the front door, stop it. I made my way back to the section on church history and comparative religions and such, and I found a bookshelf that had books on Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam, and I thought, if I ever need any information about these religions, now I know where to go. Went down to the next shelf, and they had books on Jehovah's Witnesses, Baha'i, Christian Science, Unification Church, and I thought, hey, if I ever need any information about these groups, now I know where to go. Then I went down to the next two shelves, and they were entirely devoted to Mormonism. I began leafing through the books on these shelves, and I was quite shocked by the fact that these books referred to Mormonism as a cult, C-U-L-T. And I decided that afternoon to purchase a couple of those books, something that we were told not to do as Mormons, because these were anti-Mormon books, so-called. But I decided I would purchase these books, take them back to school with me. I would look up all the footnotes and show that these authors were one of two things. They were either desperately ignorant about what it was that we as Mormons believed, or they were viciously wicked deceivers. But either way, they were wrong. So, if you've ever gone to school on a quarter system, you know what happens right after Thanksgiving. Theologically, we call it the Great Tribulation. It's final season. You know, it's when you start going to class. You start studying someone's notes. I mean, you become kind of like an instant scholar at the end of the term. It's great. Get your money's worth, something. I actually didn't return to my courses. I got almost straight failing grades that term because I spent 8 to 10 hours a day in the library looking up as many of these footnotes as I could find. And when the libraries were closed at night, I was at home with a brand new Bible, an NIV study Bible. You know what the NIV stands for? The nearly inspired version? I'm just kidding, just kidding. NIV. Now, I picked up an NIV study Bible, and I began reading through it. And over about a 2.5-week period of looking at things in the library that dealt with the history and theology of Mormonism, where I found false prophecies, changes in doctrine, and historical cover-ups, such as this. You know, Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, denounced polygamy publicly while practicing it privately. A little hypocritical. Well, that was just the tip of the iceberg. At night with that Bible, I was reading it, and God opened my eyes to see that the God of the Bible is not even close to the gods of Mormonism. And I realized that I was involved in something that we normally associate with people who bow down before metal and wooden objects. And we call that idolatry. Would you write this down on the top of your handout, please? And it's this phrase, that idolatry is idolatry, whether it is metal or mental. Idolatry is idolatry, whether it is metal or mental. In the words of John Calvin, we human beings are perpetual idol factories.